On the morning of the ceremony, the words still rang like a wound left open. He's just a donor. They had been spoken casually with the kind of careless cruelty that assumes no consequence. Not shouted, not even said directly to him, but whispered just loud enough for him to hear as he passed a polished hallway at a previous event. That one phrase had collapsed decades of sacrifice, effort, and silent giving into a single cold label, as if he were nothing more than the signature on a check. Not a man, not a father, not a soul with a story, just a donor. And then came the envelope. Cream-colored, thick, embossed with the school's crest, a design meant to suggest honor. But when he unfolded it carefully under the kitchen light, honor was the one thing absent. His name was spelled wrong, the letters clumsy, an afterthought. The words that followed reduced him further. In gratitude to our donors. No memory of his history with the school, no mention of the years he had carried other people's dreams on his back, no sign of respect for the sacrifices behind the gift. It read like a receipt, a bill marked paid. Nothing about it felt like welcome. He sat there, invitation in hand, letting the quiet of the room deepen around him. For a brief moment, he considered not going at all. He imagined himself staying home, avoiding the awkward smiles, the perfumed indifference, the false gratitude. It would be easier. Easier than standing in a room where his worth was measured in numbers, not in humanity. But as that thought crept in, another memory rose, sharper, heavier. The memory of a boy with patched shoes, trying to hide the holes in his socks. A boy who studied under a stairwell light because the apartment had no electricity that week. A boy who once sat with an empty stomach until a teacher noticed and quietly slipped a sandwich into his bag. Her voice returned to him now as clear as if she were sitting across the table. One day, when you can, you give. Not for applause, not for thanks. You give so that another child won't carry the hunger you carried. That vow had lived inside him like a compass, steadying him through years of labor and sacrifice. It was that promise, not the invitation, that decided his steps. He pressed the paper flat on the table, smoothing the crease with his palm. Then he rose, ironed his modest jacket, polished the shoes that had seen too many ceremonies where he was ignored, and slipped both the invitation and another folded paper into the inside pocket of his coat. The invitation scratched faintly against his chest, like a reminder of dismissal. But the second paper, the letter no one expected, rested heavier, almost like a heartbeat. He touched it once, lightly, as if to reassure himself. They thought they knew his role. They thought they had already written the script of his evening. A quiet donor, tucked into the background, thanked politely, then forgotten. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that before the night was over, their words would return to them, not as whispers, but as silence thick with shame. Because names, once unveiled, can never be erased. Friends, let's pause here. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Has something similar ever happened in your life when your worth was reduced to something smaller than who you really are? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone. This is how you help our channel grow and reach more people who need these stories. And now, let's continue. When he arrived at the grand entrance, the air was thick with polished greetings and the faint sweetness of expensive perfume. The school had dressed itself in celebration. Red carpets rolled over the stone steps, velvet ropes guiding guests like cattle into categories. At the registration desk, the glossy badges glimmered under soft lights, each carrying its weight of importance. VIP benefactor, distinguished guest, trustee, titles carved in gold lettering, the kind that bought a seat near the front, a camera's attention, a nod from the headmaster. When his turn came, the young attendant, eyes already searching past him for the next guest, slid a plain white badge across the table. One word, printed in small, almost apologetic letters. Donor. No flourish, no prefix, no dignity, just a donor. The ink felt as cold as the voices that had reduced him before. He pinned it quietly to his lapel, though the gesture burned inside him. Around him, other guests adjusted their glittering titles with pride, laughing, clinking glasses, moving with the assurance of those who belonged. He was nudged toward the back, beyond the velvet ropes, past the photographers who barely turned his way. He moved through the room like a shadow, present yet unseen. The architecture of exclusion was flawless here. Chairs at the front had cushions embroidered with names. His was a folding seat near the wall. Tables closest to the stage were set with polished silver and crystal, while his table bore plain cutlery, half-filled glasses, as if importance trickled down with the distance. Smiles met him, but only the kind that floated on the surface, practiced and perfumed. No one asked his story. No one leaned in to hear his voice. To them, he was simply a function, money dressed in an old suit. Yet inside, he carried something none of them could read. He remembered standing barefoot once in the schoolyard, the gravel biting into his soles, feeling invisible among children with polished shoes. He remembered the teacher who pressed a hand to his shoulder, whispering courage without an audience. That hand had been heavy with truth, heavier than these velvet ropes now trying to place him. The sting of being unseen was not new, but tonight it was sharper, because he knew something they did not. He sat in the back, his plain badge catching the low light. Around him, the chatter of wealth filled the air like an orchestra tuned to self-importance. And still, he remained silent. Silent, but not small. He touched the inside of his coat briefly, feeling the folded paper resting there, patient, waiting. They had given him a seat at the margins, but he knew that before this night was over, the center of the room, the very heart of the hall, would bear his name. The announcement came suddenly. All key benefactors, please gather for the commemorative photograph. The words sliced through the room like a bell, summoning the chosen. Men in tailored suits and women draped in shimmering gowns rose with a confidence born from certainty. They moved forward in clusters, smiling already as if the camera had granted them immortality before the flash. He followed quietly, not because he expected to be centered, but because he too had given, more than some who now strutted as if the school itself was their inheritance. At the front of the hall, photographers adjusted tripods and barked orders with brisk authority. The backdrop gleamed with the school's emblem, polished and perfect, ready to capture history. Names were called, positions assigned. Trustee, front row. Chairman, just here. Major donor, please stand in the middle. Each title was placed like a crown, each name woven into the fabric of belonging. He waited at the edge, badge pale and ordinary against his jacket, but still, he waited. One of the organizers glanced at him, then past him, eyes narrowing as though deciding where such a plain badge belonged. And then it came, soft, thoughtless, but heavy enough to crush. Would you mind holding this? A sequined handbag was pressed into his hands, casual as if he were an attendant, rather than a man whose sacrifice had built part of the very stage they now posed upon. He did not protest. He took it, the strap digging into his palm, while the others arranged themselves into neat rows of importance. The flash went off once, twice, 3 times, each burst of light freezing their smiles into permanence. Laughter followed, the easy laughter of those who knew they would appear in tomorrow's newsletter, on the school's website, in framed photographs lining the hall. He stood a step away, half-shadowed, carrying someone else's belongings while the camera wrote history without him. Another erasure, so smooth, so practiced, it almost looked natural. Inside, however, memory rose like a tide. He remembered being left out of the class photo as a boy because his shirt was torn. He had stood just beyond the frame while the others smiled, his absence unspoken but etched into his chest. That same hollow ache returned now, years older but unchanged, as the shutter clicked again and again. The room did not see the irony, that the man holding the handbag was also the man whose gift had secured scholarships that would outlast the hairstyles, the gowns, the fleeting vanity of this evening. When the session ended, handbags reclaimed, backs patted, congratulations exchanged, he He simply placed the borrowed weight back into its owner's hand and stepped aside. His place was not in their portrait, but in something larger, something none of them yet understood. He swallowed the humiliation, let it settle inside him like a stone at the bottom of a river. Silent, still, but heavy enough to shift the current when the time came. Because photographs fade, but legacies do not. He slipped out of the hall after the photographs, the echo of laughter trailing him like a shadow. The night air was cooler, and the courtyard lay quiet, far removed from the gleam of chandeliers and the clinking of glasses. A wooden bench, weathered and unadorned, stood beneath the branches of an old elm. He lowered himself onto it, letting the weight of the evening settle across his shoulders. Out here, away from polished titles and shallow smiles, memory had space to breathe. He closed his eyes, and the courtyard dissolved into another time. He was small again, knees scraped, stomach hollow, his clothes thin against the bite of winter. In that boy's world, the day began with hunger and ended with silence. He remembered staring at the other children, how their lunchboxes clicked open to reveal sandwiches, fruit, and sweets he never dared to hope for. His own hands clenched empty, pretending he wasn't hungry, pretending he could get through the afternoon with nothing but will. And then there was her, a teacher whose name lived in him like scripture. She never asked, never pointed out his lack in front of the others. Instead, each day, she carried 2 lunches in her satchel, one neatly wrapped for herself, another, smaller, slipped into his desk with no announcement. Sometimes it was bread with a smear of butter, sometimes an apple. Once, on his birthday, a slice of cake folded carefully in wax paper. She never looked for gratitude, only placed her hand gently on his shoulder, as if to say, "You are not forgotten." Her kindness became the map of his life. It was not the food itself that fed him most, but the dignity she protected. She gave without demand, without fanfare, and in doing so taught him what true giving meant. He carried her words in the marrow of his bones. One day, when you can, you'll make it easier for another child. Those words lit a fire in him that no insult, no dismissal, no badge with the wrong name could extinguish. It was for her that he had written his first check, trembling at the weight of it. It was for her that he had agreed to remain anonymous, letting the focus rest on the children rather than himself. And it was for her that he endured nights like this one, silent humiliations swallowed, because what mattered was not where he sat, or whether his name appeared in a photograph, but that a child somewhere would sit in a classroom with a full stomach and a steady chance. He looked at the school's windows, glowing in the distance, heard the muffled music from the hall, and felt the folded paper in his coat once more. Tonight they had given him a seat in the shadows, a badge without honor, a roll stripped down to numbers. But she had once given him light in a world that offered only hunger, and that light was still burning. He sat a little straighter on the bench, the memory of her voice steadier than any applause. Not for thanks, not for recognition. You give so others may rise. He had done that, and before this night was over, the world inside that glittering hall would know it too, whether they wanted to or not. He returned to the hall just as the lights dimmed, and a large screen glowed to life at the front. A board member in a dark, glittering suit stepped onto the stage, his voice booming with rehearsed enthusiasm. The audience leaned forward as numbers danced across the screen, columns rising, graphs climbing, percentages climbing like trophies. Applause erupted at each upward spike, hands clapping for the victory of figures, for the language of wealth dressed up as success. But as the bar chart swelled higher, he felt an ache deep inside him. To them, generosity had become a number, a neat line in a financial report. Each gift was reduced to data, each sacrifice flattened into color-coded progress. They cheered the millions raised, the record-breaking totals, the growth compared to last year. Yet not once did the speaker mention the children who would sleep easier tonight because of those numbers. Not once did he say that a boy would carry a backpack filled with books instead of hunger, that a girl would go to school without fear of being pulled out to work. The applause filled the room, hollow and deafening. He sat at the edge, badge plain on his chest, wondering how easily the human soul was lost in celebration of numbers. He remembered the faces of students he had met briefly, the shy gratitude in their eyes, the way they clutched letters written in careful penmanship, thanking someone they did not yet know. Those letters lived folded in a drawer at his home, each one a reminder that generosity could never be captured by charts. It was not about millions. It was about a single child, one life lifted, one future rewritten. The board member's voice swelled with pride as he gestured to the highest bar on the screen. A record year, he declared, as though victory itself was measured in columns of ink. More applause thundered, glasses lifted in toast. Around him, faces glowed with satisfaction, the kind that comes from being near money, not near meaning. And yet he remained silent, hands folded in his lap. He had given quietly, without title or spotlight, because his teacher had once taught him that true giving did not need applause. But watching the crowd cheer for numbers, while forgetting the children behind them, carved a deeper wound than being excluded from a photo. They had turned sacrifice into spectacle, mercy into mathematics. He closed his eyes for a moment and imagined the unseen, a kitchen where parents could finally exhale, a desk where a child could study without hunger gnawing at his ribs, a life that would not end in the same silence that had once swallowed him. That was the truth behind the figures on the screen, the faces they never saw, the names they never pronounced, the dignity they never spoke of. When the applause ended, he straightened slowly. He would let them celebrate their charts, their records, their victories in numbers. But deep in his coat pocket, the folded paper waited, a truth that would soon rewrite their celebration entirely. He rose from his seat after the board member's speech, the sound of applause still echoing like empty thunder in his ears. For a moment he hesitated, scanning the room, watching as the so-called distinguished and major benefactors gathered at the center tables. Their chairs were upholstered in velvet, their cutlery gleamed beneath chandeliers that threw golden light across their smiling faces. A small plaque rested on each table. Major donors. The words looked almost ceremonial, as though a crown had been placed on every fork, every glass. He had given more than some of them combined, but his badge told another story. Still, he stepped forward, moving slowly, his modest jacket brushing against gowns worth more than he had once earned in a year. He approached the table marked Major Donors, his hand hovering over the back of a chair, not claiming it, only asking silently for a place. The development officer appeared instantly, with the kind of polished smile trained for moments like this, kind on the surface, dismissive beneath. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, her hand gesturing toward the filled seats, though two remained empty. "These are already reserved, but there's space toward the back." The words landed gently, but their weight pressed deep. Reserved. Back. He nodded without resistance, lowering his gaze slightly, though inside his chest something tightened like a knot. It was not the first time, nor would it be the last, that worth was measured not by sacrifice, but by perception, not by the quiet cost of giving, but by the shine of social standing. He accepted the distance they placed between money and meaning, between his presence and their pride. He walked slowly toward the dimly lit tables at the far end of the hall. These were the seats for those who did not belong in the center of photographs or speeches, those whose names would not be printed in gold. The tablecloth was plain, the glasses slightly chipped, the cutlery dull. He sat down, shoulders heavy, yet his back remained straight. The sting of exclusion burned, but he carried it as he always had, with silence, with dignity. From the distance he could see the laughter at the central tables, the way hands reached across for toasts, the way voices rose in confident cheer. None of them noticed him in the shadows. None of them knew the years of labor, the nights he had gone without so others could have more, the promises he had kept to a teacher who once gave him light when he had nothing. To them he was merely a figure in their ledger, now pushed to the back where the applause could not reach. He pressed his hand against his coat, feeling again the folded paper resting there, heavier than their velvet chairs, stronger than their titles. It waited, patient, like truth itself. One day, perhaps even tonight, it would break the distance they had created. For now he swallowed the ache, breathing quietly as the room buzzed with celebrations that excluded him. They gave him no seat among the powerful. But legacy, he knew, was not built at tables. Legacy was written where eyes could not see and numbers could not measure. He let them have their center. His time would come. He sat in the shadows of the back table, the hum of celebration wrapping around him like a cloak that did not warm. Laughter drifted from the center, the easy kind born of comfort and recognition, where names were spoken into microphones and faces were caught by cameras. He had no microphone, no camera, no toast. What he had was folded carefully inside his coat, resting close to his heart, heavier than any golden plaque. A letter, sealed, precise, undeniable. He had written it months ago, his hands steady, his mind clear. It was not a boast, not a demand for gratitude, but a simple stipulation, a condition written when he made the gift. Anonymity, until the time was right. He had insisted that the students come first, that the money not be turned into vanity or spectacle. He had wanted the scholarships to be created, the process completed, the first recipients chosen before his name appeared. Until then, he chose to be invisible, because the focus belonged on them, the children who would rise from hunger and struggle into dignity. That was what mattered. That had always been what mattered, but the time had come. The letter confirmed it. The funds were secure, the scholarships established, the students already selected. The clause of anonymity ended tonight, and with its end came the truth. His name would no longer be hidden in silence, erased in polite exclusions, or reduced to a number in a speech. The school would reveal what they had tried so hard to bury under glossy titles and golden badges. His name would stand, whether they wanted to honor it or not. He touched the outline of the envelope through the fabric of his coat. It seemed to pulse with its own life, as if aware of the weight it carried. He remembered the nights he had gone without heat so that money could be saved. He remembered mending his shoes instead of buying new ones, sending checks instead of buying comfort, all so one day some child he would never meet could sit at a desk with a full belly and a clear mind. Those sacrifices were written between every line of that letter. They were invisible to the crowd, but not to him, and soon invisibility would no longer be possible. Still, he did not imagine revenge. He did not see himself rising to expose the smug smiles of the development officer, or to shame the board members who had kept him at the margins. No, that was not his way. He had no need to wound them with anger. The truth itself was enough. The letter was not a weapon. It was a mirror. When read aloud, it would show the room who he truly was, what he had built, what they had so easily dismissed. And once reflected, the truth could never be denied again. He breathed deeply, straightening his shoulders as he sat alone at the back table. Around him the orchestra swelled, and another toast was raised, to numbers, to charts, to the faceless donors who kept the institution alive. He allowed the applause to wash over him, carrying no part of it, because tonight, applause was not what he sought. Tonight was for something greater, something that could not fade when the clapping stopped. The letter waited, and with it, justice, quiet, steady, undeniable. He drifted toward the buffet when the speeches paused, not out of hunger but to escape the weight of his corner seat. The long tables gleamed with excess, silver trays piled with delicacies, crystal bowls brimming with fruit carved into elaborate shapes. Waiters moved briskly, replenishing what was barely touched. Around him, clusters of guests leaned close in conversation, their laughter soft but sharpened with judgment. He had been among such crowds before, long enough to recognize the tone that dressed cruelty in whispers. "He doesn't look like much," one voice murmured, low enough to think it safe, but not so low that it could not be heard. "Just a donor," another replied, dismissive, as if the word itself were a smallness, a reduction, a man made into a wallet. They glanced at him briefly, their eyes skating over his worn jacket, the modest cut of his tie, the plain white badge on his chest. Then, satisfied, they turned back to their glasses, their laughter rising again. He stood still, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, his eyes lowered as though studying the arrangement of grapes, but inside, memory surged. He recalled years earlier standing in another hall, his accent thick, his words careful and deliberate. A man, one of the very trustees now smiling warmly across the room, had mocked him for it, mimicking his pronunciation with a chuckle. That same trustee now bent low to shake hands with a guest in a glittering gown, his voice honeyed, his smile practiced, his respect always reserved for those who carried visible power. The sting of it lingered, but he did not answer. He had learned long ago that silence can be heavier than retort. That dignity held in stillness cuts deeper than anger ever could. So he chose silence now, as he always had. Let them whisper. Let them laugh. Their words revealed more about themselves than about him. He lifted a glass of water from the buffet and sipped slowly, standing apart as the room swirled in its theater of self-importance. Every corner of this place seemed choreographed to remind him of his place, at the margins, unnamed, unnoticed, uninvited to the heart of recognition. Yet in his coat pocket the letter pressed against him like a steady pulse, reminding him that truth requires no defense, no spectacle. It waits, silent but inevitable. He glanced once more at the trustee who had once mocked his accent. The man's face was animated now, laughing too loudly, shaking hands too firmly, desperate to be seen, to be remembered. He felt no anger toward him anymore, only a kind of sorrow, because while that man fought to be remembered in photographs, his own name was already etched in something far stronger, not in the smiles of the powerful, but in the quiet futures of children who would one day rise because he had once fallen and chosen to lift others with him. He placed the glass back onto the table and stepped aside, vanishing into the edge of the room where whispers could no longer reach. He carried their words in silence, not as wounds, but as reminders. The world would always measure worth in appearances, but truth had its own measure, and soon, very soon, it would speak. The music softened and the chatter hushed as the MC returned to the stage. His voice, smooth and deliberate, carried through the hall. The program had been neatly printed in glossy booklets, every speech, every toast, every presentation accounted for. But now, with a small smile, the MC announced something not written in ink. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have an additional segment tonight, one that speaks not only of generosity, but of legacy, a scholarship that will outlive us all, dedicated to the students who begin with less and dream just as high." The room shifted instantly. Bodies leaned forward, glasses lowered, eyes sharpened with curiosity. This was not on the agenda. It was not another chart, not another number, not another routine thank you. A ripple of anticipation stirred through the tables, the kind of silence that meant even the powerful wanted to hear what came next. He sat at his seat near the wall, the words tightening around him like a thread pulling him toward the center. He knew this moment. He had been waiting for it, carrying it in his coat, holding it like a fire that burned silently against every humiliation of the evening. The MC continued, his voice rising with ceremony. "This scholarship," he said, "is unlike any we have announced before. It is not temporary, not a fleeting gesture, but an endowment, an enduring light for generations to come. Tonight we will reveal the name attached to it, a name chosen not by us, but written by the one who made it possible. A hush settled deeper. Forks froze midair. The laughter that had once mocked in whispers now stilled. Even the trustee who had sneered at his accent turned toward the stage, curiosity flickering in his eyes. None of them suspected. None of them could have imagined that the man sitting quietly at the back table, stripped of title and excluded from photographs, was the one whose name they were about to hear. He sat very still, his hand resting on his coat pocket, feeling the outline of the folded letter. The moment had come, the clause of anonymity ending not with his voice, not with anger, but with the institution itself forced to unveil the truth. He did not rise, did not seek attention, did not turn to meet the stares beginning to scatter through the hall. Instead, he lowered his eyes, as though listening only to the memory of a teacher's voice, the one that had once told him, "One day, when you can, you'll make it easier for another child." The MC's words swelled. "It is called the First Light Scholarship," he announced, pausing as though even the name deserved reverence. "It carries within it the story of a boy who began with little but believed in more. Tonight, we unveil not only the scholarship, but the name of the one who gave so that others might rise." The hall leaned forward as one, waiting. None of them breathed. He remained silent, waiting with them, his dignity rooted deeper than applause. A teacher stepped onto the stage, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the papers in front of her. Unlike the board members before her, she did not speak with the polished cadence of rehearsed applause lines. Her voice was softer, uneven, but it carried an honesty that immediately stilled the room. She began, not with numbers or percentages, but with a story. "It began with a boy," she said, her words dropping like stones into a silent pond. "A boy who studied by stairwell light, because his family could not always afford electricity. While others slept, he traced words in borrowed books, his fingers cold, but his mind unyielding. He worked harder than anyone because he had less than everyone." The room listened, breath caught. He sat at his table in the shadows, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Every word struck like an echo from a life he had lived long ago, one he had buried beneath decades of labor and sacrifice. He had not expected her to speak it aloud, not with such precision. She continued. "That boy grew into a young man who rode buses at night after long shifts, clutching worn textbooks against his chest, falling asleep standing but never letting go of his dream. He gave up rest so he could afford a future. He gave up warmth so he could pay for his education." Around the room, whispers stirred. Faces shifted, recognition dawning in some, unease creeping into others. They began to glance toward him, the man with the plain badge, the man who had been seated at the back, the man who had been asked to hold someone's handbag while photographs were taken. Their eyes met him briefly, then skittered away as though looking too long might expose their own guilt. The teacher's voice grew steadier. "That man became a father who signed away every luxury, holidays, fine clothes, comforts, for the sake of strangers he would never meet. He gave not to be seen, but because he remembered what it was to be unseen. He gave not to be praised, but because he knew the weight of hunger and the shame of lack." Every word pierced deeper, each detail pulling the veil from their eyes. It was no longer just a story. It was a confession of truth, threaded with sacrifice so raw it could not be denied. Those who had once whispered, "just a donor," now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The trustee who mocked his accent looked down at his glass. The development officer who had sent him to the back table tightened her jaw. The portrait of benefactors taken earlier suddenly seemed incomplete, false, almost grotesque. And yet, he did not move. He sat still, letting the story wash over him. Not with pride, not with vengeance, but with the quiet dignity of a man whose life no longer belonged to whispers. He did not need to confirm it. The truth was doing its work, piercing the room like pins, pricking the conscience of every person who had chosen appearances over substance. The teacher paused, her eyes searching the crowd.
That is the man who made this scholarship possible,
She said softly.
the one who asked for anonymity until now, the one whose name will forever be tied to the First Light Scholarship. Because he once lived in darkness, and now he has chosen to give light.
Silence followed, heavy and unbroken. All the golden badges, the velvet chairs, the glossy photographs, all of it felt hollow against the weight of that story. And in that silence, though no one spoke his name yet, the room already knew where to look. The teacher's words faded, and for a moment the hall was swallowed in silence so deep it felt like time itself had paused. Then the MC returned, his voice lower now, almost reverent. He gestured toward a tall stand draped in velvet at the center of the stage. 2 students approached, their hands small and uncertain, yet chosen for this unveiling. The MC gave a nod, and together they pulled the cloth away. The velvet slid down in a slow, graceful fall, revealing a plaque that caught the stage lights and held them like fire. Polished brass gleamed, the engraving deep and unyielding. The words were simple, but they struck the room like thunder. The First Light Scholarship, named for his surname. Gasps rose, sharp and audible, then dissolved instantly into silence. No applause followed, no polite murmur, no immediate cheer. The room froze, every face locked in recognition. They had walked past him, brushed him aside, seated him at the margins, stripped him down to a badge with a single dismissive word, donor. But here, carved into brass, impossible to erase, was the truth of who he was. His name was no longer whispered, no longer hidden in ledgers. It was now etched into the very legacy they had gathered to celebrate. He did not move. He did not rise, did not smile, did not seek their eyes. He sat as still as stone, the weight of decades pressing against him. Decades of silence, of sacrifice, of being unseen. Now the silence belonged to them. The development officer who had sent him to the back table stared wide-eyed, her smile frozen. The trustee who once mocked his accent clenched his jaw and looked away. Even the board member who had praised numbers like trophies sat rigid, his applause stilled in his lap. The plaque gleamed, steady and unflinching. In its shine they saw themselves reflected, faces of arrogance, of dismissal, of shallow judgment. Every quiet humiliation they had given him returned now, not in fury, not in vengeance, but in the undeniable permanence of brass. This was not a moment they could soften with words or erase with charm. It would hang on the wall of the school for generations, long after they were gone, long after their names were forgotten. His would remain. He lowered his eyes, his hand brushing the folded letter still in his coat, though it no longer needed to be read. The truth had already spoken. It spoke louder than any toast, louder than any photograph, louder than any whisper meant to reduce him. The room that once refused him a seat now held its breath in the shadow of his name. And in that silence, he felt no triumph, only a quiet release. The boy who once studied by stairwell light had been seen at last, not by applause, not by fleeting praise, but by something that would outlive them all. His name, carved into brass, carried the light forward. From the side of the stage, 3 students emerged, their steps hesitant, their hands clutching folded notes that trembled as much as their fingers. They were not dressed in gowns or suits, only in their best clothes, pressed carefully, shoes polished with effort, not wealth. Their eyes glistened in the bright lights, uncertain but full of something that silenced the room more than the plaque had. Honesty. The first, a boy no older than 16, unfolded his paper with both hands, his voice wavering but clear. "Because of this scholarship," he read, "I don't go to bed hungry anymore. My mother doesn't skip meals so I can eat. I can study now, not worry about whether the lights will stay on. I can dream like everyone else." His words broke on the last line, but he stood straighter, refusing to let tears undo him. The second, a girl, lifted her note. Her voice was steadier, but her hands shook.
I used to work 2 jobs after school, cleaning offices at night, stocking shelves on weekends. I was always tired, always behind in class. But this gift means I can stop running just to survive. I can be a student, not just a worker. I can believe that my future is more than exhaustion.
She looked out at the audience then, and her gaze lingered on him. Not knowingly, not yet, but with a gratitude so raw it pierced straight through. The third, younger, almost too shy to stand alone, whispered at first, then found her strength. "I was afraid," she said softly. "Afraid I wouldn't belong anywhere. Afraid I'd have to stop school and help at home. But now I can stay. I can learn. I can believe without fear." Her voice cracked, but the words landed, fragile and fierce all at once. The hall was still. No graphs, no charts, no boardroom speeches had ever commanded such silence. The rawness of their voices, the unpolished truth of their stories, filled the air with something applause could not touch. The donors at the front tables, the trustees, the officers, all of them shifted in their chairs, some with lowered eyes, some with hands fidgeting nervously, unable to meet the weight of gratitude that was not theirs to claim. He watched from his seat at the back, the plain badge still pinned to his lapel, his hands folded calmly. He did not rise, did not wave, did not claim the moment. It was never his to claim. This was theirs. Every word those children spoke carried more meaning than the speeches that had drowned the hall earlier. Their gratitude was not rehearsed, not perfumed, not rehearsed for effect. It was born from nights of hunger, days of exhaustion, hours of fear, things he knew all too well. And as he listened, he felt something inside him soften. It was not triumph he felt. It was not even vindication. It was the quiet confirmation that his sacrifices had not been in vain. That the teacher who once placed a sandwich into a hungry boy's hands had lit a chain of mercy that was now glowing on this stage. The faces of those 3 children were proof. The light had not died with him. It had passed on. He bowed his head slightly, almost in prayer. He needed no applause, no recognition. The voices of the children had given him more than any honor could. They had given him proof that his pain had been transformed into hope, that his silence had been turned into their voices. The hall did not know how to respond. There was no applause at first, only the sound of breath held too long. Because in that moment, they all knew that wealth had not built this moment. Sacrifice had, and it belonged to the man they had dismissed, ignored, erased. He remained seated as the last student's voice faded, the silence in the hall deep and fragile. Eyes turned toward him, slowly, cautiously, as if drawn by an unseen force. Some faces showed recognition, others shame, and a few carried the pale look of guilt that had nowhere to hide. But he did not search for them. He did not scan the crowd for the lips that had whispered, "He doesn't look like much," or the eyes that had dismissed him as just a donor. Their words had already crumbled under the weight of truth. At last he rose, not with grandeur, not with the authority of a man demanding his due, but quietly, steadily, as though simply honoring the moment. The room shifted with him, conversation stilled, breaths caught. He adjusted his coat, straightened his shoulders, and turned not to the board members, not to the trustees, not to the polished faces that had sought titles and recognition all evening. He looked only at the 3 students standing on stage, their small frames lit by the glow of the scholarship plaque. He nodded to them. Nothing more, just a single solemn bow of his head, a gesture that said, "This was always for you." That simple movement carried a weight heavier than speeches, heavier than applause. It was not pride that stood in him, not fury, not vengeance. It was dignity, silent, unshakable, untouchable. The hall seemed to lean into his stillness. The same people who had brushed past him at the entrance now sat frozen, unable to escape the mirror that had been held up to them. They saw the man who had been asked to hold a handbag during the photographs, the man pushed to the back of the hall, the man erased in whispers, and yet he stood taller than all of them, not because he demanded respect, but because he no longer needed it. The scholarship itself spoke for him, louder than any boast, clearer than any rebuke. Opportunity had always been the language of his life, and now it was carved into the future of children who would carry it forward. For a fleeting moment he thought of the teacher who had once slipped a sandwich into his bag. He imagined her standing at the back of the hall, watching him now, her eyes kind, her nod approving. He felt her presence in the stillness, as though she too was bowing her head to the children, as though her light had reached beyond her own life and into this moment. He did not gloat, he did not scold. He did not let anger cloud the silence that had become his greatest ally. He stood, nodded once more to the students, and then returned to his chair. The power of that dignity settled heavier on the crowd than any lecture could have. They felt it press into them, reminding them that true greatness has no need for fury. It shines in the quiet assurance of a life lived for others. The students clutched their notes to their chests, their eyes wide, their futures already shifting. The plaque gleamed behind them, a promise written not in pride but in permanence. And as he sat down, the room understood, perhaps for the first time, that they had misjudged him completely. He was not just a donor. He was a legacy in motion. The silence after his nod stretched on, heavy and unrelenting, until someone at the front cleared their throat as if to break it. The board member who had earlier gestured him politely toward the back table now rose from his velvet seat, his posture stiff, his face drained of the self-assurance he wore so easily at the start of the night. He approached with the exaggerated warmth of a man desperate to erase his own misstep. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the front rows where the chairs gleamed beneath the chandeliers. "We would be honored if you sat here, where you belong." The words, though offered with a smile, carried the unmistakable weight of shame. A seat was no longer simply a seat. It had become a confession, an acknowledgement that they had placed him in the shadows when he had always deserved the light. Before he could reply, the development officer appeared as well, the same one who had pressed the handbag into his hands and insisted the major donors table was full. Now her smile wavered, her words stumbling over themselves. I owe you an apology," she whispered, though in the silence of the hall it sounded louder than intended. Her polished composure faltered, the rehearsed charm cracked. For once, she looked not like an official representative of the school, but like a woman confronted by her own reflection, and not liking what she saw. He listened quietly, his face calm, his eyes steady. Then he offered a small nod, not one of triumph, but of release. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice carrying no bitterness, no accusation. His words were almost tender, though they carried the undeniable strength of a man who had never needed their recognition to stand tall. When they insisted again that he take a seat at the front, he shook his head gently. Instead, he made a single request. "One photograph," he said. "Not of me in the center. Let the students stand there, by the plaque. I'll take the edge of the frame." The request stunned them more than any rebuke could have. In a hall where everyone fought for the center, for the spotlight, for the memory that would hang on walls, here was a man who chose the margins willingly. Yet in doing so, he made the margins the most powerful place of all. The children would stand in the middle, the brass plaque shining behind them, their hands clutching the notes that spoke of hunger relieved and fear undone. And he, the man they had dismissed, would stand just outside their glow, content that the light belonged to them. The board member swallowed. The development officer lowered her eyes, and the room shifted. For years they had measured importance by proximity to the center, but in that single moment they understood that dignity does not need position, that legacy does not require applause. His quiet refusal, his gentle insistence on putting the students first, was the final, unspoken lesson. Greatness is not found where the lights are brightest, but where the sacrifice is deepest. The photographer raised the camera. The students stepped into the center, uncertain at first, then standing taller as though they felt the weight of what it meant. He moved to the side, his badge plain, his presence quiet. The flash went off, capturing forever the truth they had tried to erase. Not pride, not vanity, not fury, but opportunity made flesh. A man in the margins, children in the light, a name carved into brass. That was the photograph that would outlast them all. When the evening finally drew to its slow and awkward close, the hall no longer buzzed with laughter and chatter. It emptied in uneven waves, people leaving in clusters, their voices hushed, their steps slower than when they had arrived. The golden badges that had gleamed so proudly at the start of the night seemed dim now, mere trinkets against the weight of what they had witnessed. Their eyes still lingered on the plaque, its brass surface catching the last of the stage lights. His name was there, not as a whisper, not as an afterthought, not as a number in a ledger, but as something carved, permanent, undeniable. He did not hurry to leave. He sat for a while at the back table, watching as one by one they slipped out, their carefully polished masks cracking under the silence that clung to the room. Those who had once passed him without a glance now struggled to meet his eyes. Some offered small nods, a few stretched out trembling hands, but he answered each gesture with the same calm dignity he had carried all night. He asked for nothing more than what he had already been given. Their shame was their own to carry, not his to demand. At last, he rose. The hall was nearly empty now, the decorations beginning to lose their shine, the velvet ropes dismantled by staff already preparing to fold the night into memory. He walked toward the stage where the plaque remained uncovered, glowing with the stubborn brightness of truth. The First Light Scholarship, his surname etched deeply beneath, fixed there long after voices would fade. He stood before it in silence, not basking, not gloating, but remembering. He remembered the stairwell light where he once traced words in borrowed books. He remembered the buses that rattled through the night, where he clutched textbooks and fought exhaustion. He remembered the father he had once been, calculating bills at a kitchen table, choosing sacrifice so a stranger's child could have a chance. And most of all, he remembered the teacher who once slipped a sandwich into his empty hands, who had said, "One day, when you can, you'll make it easier for another child." Her voice lived in this plaque, in these scholarships, in the trembling voices of the 3 students who had stood on the stage. She was gone, but her mercy had not died. It had multiplied, passed through him, and would now outlive them all. As he turned to leave, he felt the weight of the badge still pinned to his lapel. Donor. The word that had been used all night to flatten him, to erase his story. He touched it briefly, then removed it, placing it gently on the empty table as he passed. That label no longer belonged to him. His name had outgrown it. They had tried to call him just a donor, but tonight proved that mercy, once lived, cannot be reduced to money. Mercy becomes memory. Mercy becomes legacy. He stepped outside into the night air, cool and quiet. The stars above faint but unwavering. Behind him the school glowed, its walls already carrying his story, though he had asked for no spotlight. Somewhere, 3 students walked out into their own futures, carrying with them more than financial help. They carried the truth that someone had once believed in them before the world did. And one day, perhaps, they too would remember this moment and pass it forward. His name would not be spoken with dismissal anymore. Not as a number, not as a faceless contribution. It would be remembered as mercy, as sacrifice, as dignity that never sought recognition, yet found it all the same. The hall would hang the photograph. The plaque would shine long after tonight's guests were forgotten, and children he would never meet would sit in classrooms with full stomachs, with lights above their desks, with futures unchained from fear. As he walked into the dark street, he felt no triumph, only a quiet peace. He had carried silence all his life, and tonight that silence had spoken. His legacy was no longer fragile. It was undeniable. It was unerasable. And it would live on, not in applause or speeches, but in every stranger who found hope where once there had been none.